show off a little bit the Raddic Talzela deck. I think it's a very fun commander to play. The key points of this commander are the hexproof from white and hexproof from black, and in a format where most of the best single target removal is in those two colors. It makes it a very resilient commander. And the second point is that the spellbook has 15 spells, and in it you've got Knight of the Ebon Legion, which is great, especially if you connect with Raddic. It's getting a counter. Cavalier of Dawn is removal. Benelish Marshal, not great, but Cavalier of Night is. Murderous Rider, more removal. Order of Midnight gives you a flying attacker and can get back a creature from the graveyard, especially interesting with cards like Midnight Rider on the Cavaliers. Claimed Contender can give you card advantage. Dauntless Bodyguard to give Raddic Indestructible. Valiant Knight, not a great hit. Smitten Swordmaster, surprisingly good at draining out your opponents later in the game. Black Lance Paragon is single target creature removal in effect. History of Benalia is a great way to give yourself board and pump, and also resilience against wraths. And Circle of Loyalty is likewise a great pump and resilience against wraths. So of these, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 with Black Lance Paragon removal spells, and a lot of just value and resilience built in. Really, there are only so Midnight Rider, Guardian of Faith, not great. Benelish Marshal, not great. And Valiant Knight, not great. So 4 out of 15 is not bad, especially since probably you will not see 3 of those in the same draft. And I think it's just a fun commander. It's resilient. It gives you card advantage built in. You don't have to attack with Raddic, but with any knight, which is nice. And it blanks so much removal. So I've got things separated here. First, the 1 and 2 CMC knights. 1 drop's so important in this semi-aggro, semi-mid-range deck. Changeling Outcast cannot be blocked, which makes it interesting. First Strike is always great to be able to attack in. Worthy Knight, just adding board presence. A lot of the spells from the spellbook are here. Black Lance Paragon, Knight of Death's Shadow. Incidentally, good value against decks that have life gain built in. Triumphant Adventure, value. Winter Moor Commander, it's nice to have Death Touch on the night. Claimed Contender, here as in the draft book. Nadar, great value with the dungeon crawling. It can incidentally buff your team if you complete a dungeon. Ardenvale Tactician is a flying knight. One of the weaknesses of this deck is flyers. Knight Tribal in Orzhov colors does not have a great way to deal with flyers, so any we can get is great. I'll talk a little bit about this later. It could be cut for another card. Then we have so you see that the Knight curve stops at 3 and then tops out at 4 with Raddic, because we really want to play more of an aggro mid-range strategy. We're not trying to get out big creatures, we're trying to get out value creatures that can activate Raddic and give us hopefully access to more removal or more board presence to our advantage. So we're with an aggressive start, we can close out the game on turn 5, sometimes 6, so that the low curve is really important. Then we have sort of the the synergistic, somewhat synergistic, or just beneficial class of spells, Paladin class. Clear into Dust for card draw and incidental life gain. Malika Rebirth against Wraths. General Enforcer, also against Wraths. It's really just there as an extra Dauntless bodyguard. Maul of this, and one that can block, importantly. So that's why General Enforcer is here instead of a card like the Dog. Let's see. Selfless Savior. There it is. Not a great blocker, but a 2/3 for 2 can gum up the board if it's necessary versus other aggro decks. Maul of the Skyclaves to give any of our knights the ability to swing in. Makes Raddic a 6/6 flying first strike creature. Adeline is just great value. It's a great aggro card. It fits in with the strategy, and is a knight. Sorry, it should be here. Fits in with our strategy of mid-range, lower mid-range aggro. History of Benalia, board presence, aggro. Resilience against Wraths, Black Market Connections, gives us a knight, draws cards, gives us a token. If we only draw 3 lands, this is a great turn 3 spell. Knight's Charge, the life gain can be very important, and the activated ability has the potential to be great if your yard is full, especially because you can use it on your opponent's end step. We have some hand hate cards, Duress, Mind Spike, Thoughtseize. If you don't see Inquisition of Kozilek there, that's because I don't have it crafted. I'll talk about those cards a little later. Then we have our interaction. So this is the great part about playing in Orzhov colors, is it's just packed full of single target interaction. Curse of Silence, Mana Tithe, which is such a great card to have access to in non-blue colors. Patriarch's Humiliation, Swords to Plowshares. Really just all of the great single target interaction. And Cavalier of Night, obviously, is outside of the curve that I spoke about earlier, but here I'm going to consider it as removal and a body. And the lifelink is really important in this deck because there are a few ways we hurt ourselves, and we don't have many ways to recover that life back. So it's going to be a really important card. Likewise, the Knight's Charge. Another difficulty in this deck can be indestructible creatures. We have some exile spells. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And Patriarch's Humiliation, we can consider that. 10, but more is always better. So for cards like Tusky, or again for flyers, Cry of the Carnarium, Pestilent Haze are great. Wraths also against small creature aggro decks that clog up the board, like Amara or Catilda, Dawnheart Prime. Crippling Fear is a great Wrath that is completely one-sided, so we can choose Knight. We can also, if it's necessary, if we're playing in the mirror, choose, for example, depending on what creatures we have out, something like Vampire, Orc, Zombie, and again, it works in our favor, and even if we choose Knight, if we choose something other than Knight, Raddic survives. Doom Foretold, in this kind of deck where we're usually drafting a creature into our hand every turn, is such great value for us, and acts as removal on creatures that aren't so important because we just get new ones on our board and 1 creature per turn from the opponent's board. We have 2 Wraths, just in case, Blood on the Snow, we play snow-covered plains and swamps, so we can get back our creature if necessary. We have 2 mana rocks, and then we get to the cards that are not included in the deck. So there are some cards here that I don't have crafted, that if I did I would include. Dark Ritual is definitely one of those. Inquisition of Kozilek is one of those. Pendragon Besieged gives us something against flyers and against indestructible creatures like Tusky. Don't have it crafted. It's once per turn on our end step. So I'm not convinced it's great, but it's an interesting card. Grind is similar idea. Lets us get rid of indestructible 1/1s or flyers, but not convinced it's great. Now, Phyrexian Arena, again, we don't have a great way to gain life, and this card can end up killing us. We're also not super interested in drawing new cards, because we have access to our spellbook through Raddic that we can play if we don't have any cards in hand. Languish could be another great card in this deck, although it does hit Raddic. It gives us a way, again, to get rid of indestructible creatures and flyers. Shieldred, given that we have the problem with life gain, it's a low on the curve. It would be our highest non-commander knight that doesn't have removal built in. It's not a knight. But it can help drain the opponent, which, again, given that we are somewhat an aggro deck, can help us get through with a little bit of reach towards their life total. And it gives us the incidental life gain 2 per turn. It's also just a great body for 4 mana. Yahenni's Expertise. This would be another Wrath that lets us play to the board as well. The Circle of Loyalty was in the deck before, but given you can draft it, and it's not great, it's essentially banner effect, giving all your creatures +1/+1, and you can generate tokens off of it, but just not great for the cost. It's great if you can draft it later in the game and put it down for 3 or 2 mana, but it's not something we need taking up a spot in the deck. The Immortal Sun definitely could be a great hate piece for Planeswalkers, but we are really mana starved usually with our drafting. We are playing using all our mana every turn and tapping out for 6 for this card. Could be great if you're playing against a Planeswalker commander, but usually you have other ways to deal with the Planeswalker. All of this removal, a lot of it does hit Planeswalkers: Bloodchief's Thirst, Fateful Absence, Despark, Rite of Oblivion, Vanishing Verse, some Planeswalkers, Skyclave Apparition, some Planeswalkers, Murderous Rider, Soul Transfer, Legion to Ashes, Baleful Mastery. So we have other ways to deal with that, besides just attacking into them. Forsworn Paladin, great 1-drop, don't have it crafted. Knight of Grace, and Knight of Malice. Again, the first strike is great. The hexproof from black or the hexproof from white give them a lot of resilience, as black and white have the best single target removal in the format. So they could be considerations for the deck. They're not in at the moment. Steadfast Paladin likewise gives us lifelink, which, as I've discussed, is a problem for this deck. Arvard, same idea, giving us lifelink. He's a good blocker and can potentially pump him up and get him back with the Draft Order Midnight from Raddic's spellbook, or the one that we play. So even in the graveyard, we'll gain value, and we can get him back. And for 2, it's not a bad cost, so that might be one to add. Metallic Mimic, sort of low statted. It gives us a knight, and it gives buffs to other knights. So that might be an interesting card to add as well, and we can play it off of any mana. Guardian of Faith is a bit slow. Its intention was to evade Wraths, but the deck is pretty resilient as is, so it was a cut. Benalis Marshal, we're not a pure aggro deck. We are an aggro mid-range deck, and the 3-white makes this impossible almost to cast on turn 3. So it's just not interesting for our deck. It's also one of the weaker cards to draft. Midnight Reaper, again, we don't need to be taking more damage, and card advantage we usually already have. And because so many of our cards are synergistic in that we're attacking in or they're removal, if we're getting Wrath or we're blocking, we're usually not so worried about value because we've been able to draft. And we can always draft Midnight Reaper if we feel we need it. And for 3, not doing anything when you play it, not being a great attacker with only 2 toughness, just not an interesting card to have in. Breathless Knight with lifelink is a consideration to replace something like Ardent Veil Tactician. The toughness hurts, the toughness drop hurts, but lifelink, again, something that we have difficulty with, and flyers are something we have difficulty with. Adaptive Automaton is another consideration to buff the team as an anthem, but whether or not we really need on turn 3 that +1/+1, or we'd rather be playing a removal and a 1-drop, or just a better 3-drop Knight. It's a question, not sure that's a great one to put in. Same with Coalition Construct. Faceless Agent gives us card advantage, but also a Knight, but card advantage, again, not something we really struggle with given the draft ability from the spellbook. Bazari's Lieutenant at 4 does give us a little bit of resilience. The protection from multicolored is nice. Arguably could be included, but for 4 mana it's a lot, and when you compare it to something like Shieldred, we would much prefer to have the Shieldred type effect. And then Champions of Tyr, this is definitely a 4-drop that I would consider adding if I had it. It gives you, in effect, 2 cards. It gives you 2 flying cards. It gives you the option to give more of your creatures flyers or lifelink, and those are all things we have issues with. It's 4, it's a little expensive, but it's got nice power, and it gives us some tools. It gives us a lot of tools to work with the difficulties we have. So that could definitely be a consideration. Over here we have some lands that I don't have crafted. Agadeem's Awakening could replace a swamp. Forsaken Crossroads, Snarl, Concealed Courtyard, and Phyrexian Tower, given, again, that oftentimes we don't need our creatures once they've served their purpose, especially a lot of the 1-drops. We don't mind losing them, or drafted cards. It gives us a little bit of ramp. And then the mana base over here. So that's the deck. That's the idea behind it. If you were going to make some changes, if I were going to make some changes, they would be cuts to add in some of these cards. Definitely Dark Ritual. Definitely Forsworn Paladin. Maybe Inquisition of Kozilek. And the rest of these, they're good cards, but it's questionable what exactly they would be replacing. Arverd could probably replace Wintermoor Commander. Shieldred might replace something. Yahani's Expertise definitely could go in. But again, these are more questionable cards. These are the 3 that I would definitely want in. So that's the deck, and I hope to show you some interesting games with it.